All right, so here in the vehicles controller, in the last lecture, we added this parameter in the constructor, iVehicleRepository. Now we also have this Vega DB context here. This class derives from DB context, which is one of the Entity Framework classes. So this means our controller is tightly coupled to Entity Framework. And in order to decouple it from Entity Framework, we need to replace the references to this DB context with something else. So in the last lecture, we had 3 references to DB context, which we replaced with an iVehicleRepository. Now over this lecture and the following lecture, we're going to do more refactoring and replace the other references to DB context with something else. Now you might ask, why do we want to do this? Why do we want to decouple our controller from Entity Framework? What is the benefit of doing so? Well, the reason we did this in the last lecture was specifically for removing duplicated code. But there is another advantage in decoupling our controller from Entity Framework, and that is it makes it a lot easier to replace Entity Framework with a different ORM. Now, here you might be skeptical and say, why do you want to do that? Well, as your application grows, you may want to use a different persistence framework in certain parts of your application, maybe for performance reasons. Maybe you want to use a micro ORM. Maybe you want to use plain ADO.NET with stored procedures. The fewer references we have to DB context, the easier it is to replace Entity Framework with a different ORM. Now, this is what we had in the last lecture before our refactoring. So in our controllers, in 3 actions, we were referencing DB context to get a vehicle from the database. After we introduce this repository class, now we have only one place where we are referencing DB context. Of course, our controller is still using DB context because our refactoring is not finished. But what I want you to take away here is that we replaced 3 references with only 1 reference. Now, if in the future, I want to change the way I get a vehicle object from database, there is only one place I need to modify. If I want to use plain ADO.NET with stored procedures, I only need to modify this getVehicle method in this repository. See the benefit? Now, the larger our application is, the more references we have to DB context. So if we move this DB context somewhere else, we're going to reduce the impact of changing Entity Framework with another ORM. Okay? And by the way, this is the basic of object-oriented programming. Separate what changes from what doesn't. So I repeat that. Separate what changes from what doesn't. All right, so back in our vehicles controller, I want to find all the references to this DB context. So here's our context field, Shift, and F12. Here's the first reference to this DB context. We add a vehicle to the vehicle's DB set. So in our create vehicle action, this is the line that we need to replace. Now I told you that a repository is like a collection of domain objects in memory. We can add an object to a collection, we can remove an object from a collection, we can get an object from a collection. These are the operations that we have in a collection. Think of the list class, think of the collection class. Repository is exactly the same. Think of it as a collection of objects in memory. So I'm going to go to our vehicle repository and add a new method here, public void add, takes a vehicle object and simply adds it to this context. So context.vehicles.add vehicle. So note that here we're encapsulating this DB context inside our repository in one class. So we're separating what changes from what doesn't. Because DB context, because Entity Framework may change, we are separating it from our main application code. Now here we need to add this method to our interface as well. Unfortunately, in VS Code, we don't have this refactoring yet. Hopefully it will come in the future. So we need to manually add this method to iVehicleRepository. All right, now back in our controller. Here in create action, I'm going to replace this line with repository.add_vehicle. Now here we have another reference to DB context for saving the changes, but we're going to look at this in the next lecture. So next, let's go to delete vehicle action. Here's another reference, context.remove. So once again, we're going to go in our repository and add a method to remove an object. So vehicle repository, public void, remove vehicle, and we remove it from the context. Next, we need to add this to our interface. So let's go to iVehicle repository. Done. And finally, back in the controller, replace context.remove with repository.remove. Now note that here in this action, we have another reference to DB context for getting a vehicle by its ID. Now earlier, we implemented this method in our repository. However, in that method, we are eager loading this vehicle object with all its related properties. Now that's a heavy operation. We don't need to load a complete vehicle in order to delete it. So all we need here is just a simple vehicle object. So how can we implement this? Well, let's go back to our repository. Here is our getVehicle method. We can add a second parameter here, a boolean called includeRelated. Now we can check if includeRelated is false. We're going to return await context.vehicles.findAsync. Now, since in most scenarios, we need to include the related objects, I'm going to give this the default value of true. Now, next, we need to make this change in our interface. So, once again, in iVehicle repository, I'm going to add this second parameter here. Include related set to true. Now, back in our controller, I'm going to replace this line with repository.getVehicle. And as the second argument, I'm going to pass false. Now, when someone reads this code, they don't know what is this false. So to make my code more readable, I'm going to use named parameters here, or named arguments. Include related false, like this. It's very explicit. Now, back in vehicle repository, a question you might have is, what if in some applications, in certain situations, we only need to load a few related properties, not all of them? So here we're loading the complete vehicle object, but what if we want to load only a vehicle and its model, not its features? Well, you could add another method here, public async task of vehicle, and call it getVehicle with make or with model, whatever, and give the ID here. So this way, you tell your repository explicitly what you want to load. And this is one of the issues that some developers find it hard to use the repository pattern because they're used to composing queries like this in their controllers, and in each action, they could load a different set of objects. So when I tell them that they should not expose iQueryable from their repositories, they don't know what to do. You should only expose your domain objects or their collections from your repositories. So here we can return a vehicle or an IEnumerable of vehicle, but not iQueryable of vehicle. Because if you return iQueryable, somewhere else in the code, someone else is going to get that iQueryable and add more stuff to it. And this is exactly against the whole idea of using the repository pattern, because we want to encapsulate these queries inside one class. Okay? So we have removed some more references to DB context in our controller. What is remaining is this context that save changes. And that's what we're going to look at in the next lecture.